Welcome everybody to Wisdom of the Elders. Well, everybody's on my right, to my left. On my immediate left is
I'm always to the left.
Deidra McCalla, whose name I consistently misspell because I'm so concerned about writing DEI instead of DIE. I forget about the whole second half of the name, so my apologies for that.
No problem.
And then in the middle, as you must know by now, is Rhonda Rucker and Sparky Rucker over on the far left, where he has been for most of his life. So usually we start these things by asking each elder to give about 1 minute self-introduction. So why don't we start with you, Sparky?
Good luck will keep me to a minute. Wow. James David Rucker Jr. got the nickname Sparky because when I was 6 days old, my aunt came into the hospital and saw me there, and she says, "Oh, look at his eyes, they sparkle." And because I was a junior, it was easier for me to have a nickname. Because if you just go, "James, get in here," you know, all the Jameses would come rushing in. And never thought I'd do this for a living. Never thought about it. You know how you got to get your job. You know, you got to work hard, and you know. And I kept thinking, man, what's the point in living if you're not going to have any fun in this thing? And it was kind of like all the doors were shut, and then there was this window that said, "Be a traveling folk musician." That was the thing that was left to me after I got into all the trouble I got into. Thank goodness I got into that trouble.
I'm Rhonda Rucker. I was born in the Louisville, Kentucky area, and initially went into medicine and practiced internal medicine for 5 years, and then I decided I should have something to fall back on. So at that point I went into folk music, and it's been a wild ride. I'm still falling, yeah. You go ahead.
My name is Deidra McCalla. There's an invisible R in my first syllable. Leave it to my mom, some letters are silent, others are invisible. And I must say, Art's invitation to be on this panel precipitated a bit of an existential crisis when I read the email, because I wasn't really sure I was ready to come out as old. So that really took a fair amount of thought, but in that thought process, realizing that I've been doing this for 50 years. I count the beginning of my career from the first time I was ever paid for a gig. The year 1973 was a watershed year of many things happening in my life. At one, I had my first paid gig, Our Lady of Lourdes High School Coffee House. I was in college, and they treated me like I was Elvis by the end of the coffee house, and that was wonderful. And then later on that year, my very first album called Fur Coats and Blue Jeans on Roulette Records, which was a minor major label, as I always describe it. It was the home of Tommy James and the Shondells. So that was the year that my first professional release, and I've been a performer ever since. I majored in theater in college. Performing is all I've ever wanted to do, and I've been very blessed and graced that I found a home in folk music, discovering Joan Baez when I was in high school, and growing from there and having the synchronicity of coming up at the same time that a very strong cultural movement called women's music was developing around the same time, and helping forge and becoming a member and a participant and a minor major star in that. Performing in folk music has been my sustenance for 50 years, so I embrace my eldership.
All right. That brings up a couple of obvious questions. The first being one, How the heck did Roulette sign you? Because you don't sound a thing like Tommy James.
You know, it was really, it was a time when I had actually, even from high school, had been trying, working with a friend from high school who thought that, you know, I had that kind of potential. He actually got me an audition with Elektra Records, even. And then at that time, when you met with the A&R man, you've heard people talk about A&R men here. It really was always men. And you would go down to the office and do an in-office audition. And he liked what he heard, but the ultimate decision was, we just signed 3 girl singers, so we really don't need more. They had just signed Carol Hall, I forget who the other one was, but the other was Carly Simon. So I lost out on a record deal to Carly Simon. So I had already been trying, but the happenstance was my uncle was a vice president at Roulette, and he was over at a Thanksgiving dinner and wanted to escape from the relatives and came to the back room where I was playing guitar with my cousin Steve, and he said, "Sing me the last thing you wrote." And so I sang him this song, and he went, "Sing me something else you wrote." And I sang, and he said, "Can you come down to the office tomorrow?" And I wound up, you know, he took me to their A&R man and said, "This is my niece. Tell me what you think." And that's how it happened.
Wow.
Yeah, they actually, I did 3 of my own songs on that. This Magic Moment, you know, the hit from the 50s was on it. And they insisted actually that I sing a Tommy James tune on it also. So that's how that came about. And the best thing about that experience is that I learned a lot about the industry. And it took a lot of the glitter and stardust out of my eyes, and I think gave me a much more solid perspective on what a mainstream industry career could or couldn't do for me.
When and how did you become aware that there was something called women's music that was evolving, that you were part of a first generation of something really big?
You know, it really, to some extent, was a simultaneous development. I think Olivia Records, that I ultimately became associated with, marks their start from that watershed year, 1973. Things that became known as women's music happened before then. And it was because a group that I had brought to college as a presenter, I ran the radio station, and we produced a concert for a group called the Deadly Nightshade, which was a 3-woman group on RCA Records. They were the first women to actually, they had control over their PR, which was unheard of at the time. And so I brought them to my college and kind of struck up a friendship, went to see them after graduation, and their manager, Ron Shelley, said, you know, "Are you going to this women's music, to this festival in Indiana?" And we were like, my friend Debbie and I were like, "What festival?" And he told us about the National Women's Music Festival, which we had never heard of. But Debbie, who was my best friend and pretending to be my manager at the time, called them up and said, "Hi, I'm Debbie Rubenfeld, and I represent Deidra McCalla. She's a recording artist from Roulette Records. I'm still just graduating from college. And, you know, we heard about your festival, and I wound up getting a booking right away at that festival. I, years later, talked with Kristen Lems, who was the founder of the National Women's Music Festival in Champaign-Urbana, where she was a college student and started this festival. And she said on the other end of the phone, when Debbie called, you know, they were, of course, very impressed, and she said she hung up the phone and said, "Wow, that was New York." But the thing about the term women's music is in many ways a misnomer, because in a sense that folk music isn't just about the music, something that Angus was saying yesterday. Women's music really was about a cultural revolution. And it was not just about the music that was coming out at the time. For those of us that remember back to the 70s and before, women were only allowed in the industry basically to be the front singers, the chick singers. And those women that started women's music really envisioned women being involved in all aspects of the entertainment industry. If you've seen the movie, one of the movies about Aretha, One of the segments is about how she wasn't allowed to list herself as producer on her own albums, even though she had produced them. Women weren't producers. Women weren't A&R men. Women weren't sound engineers. Women weren't the tech people. Women weren't in the forefront of Carol Kay being an exception of being the instrumentalist. Women weren't the music distributors. Women weren't the decision makers. And that really was what women's music as a cultural movement was designed to do, was to provide those jobs and opportunities for women in an industry where there wasn't a glass ceiling. There was steel doors in the way. And I think we helped change that. Yeah.
Well, Sparky, it took about the first half of my life to get to where I could work in arts and activism together, but I think you stumbled into arts and activism at a very young age.
Well, I mean, let's face it. It's like if I were living in Ukraine, war came to me. Being part of the post-war generation that first started to college, and then realizing that the activism that I got into was actually given to me by my father and mother. My father, when he came back from World War II, he and his brothers started an organization called the Young Men's Civic League in Knoxville, Tennessee, the very first civil rights movement or institution in Tennessee. But of course, it's your daddy, right? And I heard them talk about it all along. And I was at a workshop at Highlander Center. Come on, you coal miners, is what it was called. People like George Tucker and Nimrod Workman and Sheldon Thompson. There's this, because I'm the oldest person on this panel, I'm having a senior moment here. Tillman Cato, union organizer, always was packing because he was around where everybody carried a gun. And he knew that if he didn't carry that gun, he wasn't going to be carrying anything very long. But he was sitting and talking to me, and he said, Sparky Rucker, you the kid of those Rucker fellas that started that Young Men's Civic League, and all of a sudden, click, 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 all the lights came on in my head. Here's this man, this very well-known union organizer in Kentucky that knew about this organization my father started. But sometimes we never see that forest for the trees, do we? But as I was growing up, every year he paid my membership in the NAACP. I got to write that little button, In fact, I just was looking through a box back here about a week ago and finding all those old radical buttons and Dick Gregory for president and all of a sudden I'm finding all those old little NAACP buttons that I had in my little collection. And of course, my mother took me to my first demonstration. In fact, Rhonda wrote a book about that, about my first civil rights demonstration. In fact, why don't you?
Well, it's called Make a Change. It's a picture book. And actually, I made the kid a little bit younger than...
But she won't make me younger, I've noticed that.
He was actually 14. It was, I guess, 1960 or so. When this happened, but Rich's department store in Knoxville, Tennessee, wouldn't let people sit down at the lunch counter. And some of the Knoxville College students and some of the other people in town decided to, protest, and his mother dragged him to that demonstration. And that was your first civil rights demonstration. You learned a lesson at that.
Right. Well, the thing is, to have a demonstration, you had to have a parade permit, which is weird. You got to go to the mass and say, "Can I demonstrate?" But then we noticed, well, every day we see standing on these street corners downtown these preachers with the Bibles in their hands, stomping on it to try to save you from the devil. They always put that L in there, you know, devil. And they didn't get a parade permit. Well, why don't we just go down and have a pray-in? Riches covered an entire city block. And we got enough people to encircle that whole store and knelt down to pray. And I'm still a little scared because, you know, the Klan was pretty. In fact, I've had a lot of deals with the Klan. I don't even want to go into that stuff right now. But I'm sitting there and everybody else is praying. I got my hand like this because if somebody touches my mama, I'm going to slug him. And this old guy's walking, and he looked like a hobo, kind of walking, chewing tobacco. And oh, here comes one of them. Here comes one of them. Get ready. And he looked at me and he went, hey. Because all he saw was a little boy. And that's the thing that turned me around about not reacting to anger. Sometimes you got to do it with love. That's what Dr. King taught us. You got to love people. That's what Jesus taught his disciples. I ain't preaching to you. I'm just telling you about the history. Is that you got to use love to turn that anger. And there's so much that we in Southern Appalachia have to fight about. They've taken off the tops of our mountains. They've stolen all our precious lumber and the coal. And then they make us work in those jobs that destroys our home. But we got to show them the love, because these people, obviously something went wrong with them. Like I was telling somebody yesterday, Donald Trump must have been that fat boy that everybody picked on in school, and he never got over it. That's, you know. Putin, oh my God, with a name like Putin, and he had to live with that? But that's what music does for us. That's the way we've been able to fight back. Because every time, that's why people sing in church, is to make them feel like one. And I know when we were in those churches getting ready to go off those marches, scared to death. The people out there with torches and whatnot and guns. And we would, well, we're going to sing this song together. And all of a sudden you're singing together and you're feeling good. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Oh, keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. And all of a sudden you went, oh man, you could slay dragons. I know this ain't the question you asked, but that's the answer you got.
Well, the answers are a lot more important than the question.
We go way back. We're good friends.
Yes, we are. They got frequent visitor points at Shea Art. Well, Rhonda, in your copious free time as a medical student and doctor, how did you become a musician?
Well, I had always been into music. I mean, I begged to take piano when I was little, and both of my older brothers were taking it. And so my mom finally agreed to let me, and I was 4 years old. And the teacher was a genuine character, I'll tell you. Her name was Fanny Woods Mansfield. And she was always like 80-something years old, even when she was born. And she was a ragtime composer. And I talked to her son. She died when I was in 8th grade. So at that point, she tried to teach me how to read music, because she wasn't very successful at that. But after she died, it's been a while, probably 20 years ago or so, I talked to her son, and he said that he still hears some of her ragtime pieces, like on the Bugs Bunny Hour and things like that. Somebody online had attributed her pieces to a man. Yeah. And, but I set the record straight on that one. Anyway, because it was a piece I knew she wrote. She taught us the piece, and this guy was a ragtime expert. He was saying that it was written by somebody else. And anyway, but Fannie Woods Mansfield was her name, and she, in fact, she, during I guess it was during the 70s that a lot of women were wearing wigs. They went through this thing where wigs were really popular. Well, she got a wig, and she was wearing it all the time and everything. And then she told my mom this story, because my mom had a wig too, and told my mom this story about, I wasn't fixed up or anything, and somebody rang the doorbell, and I grabbed my wig and put it on and went and answered the door and had this conversation with this guy. And then she went back in her bedroom and she noticed the wig was on backwards. So she was that kind of person. Anyway, I started, really young doing that. And after she died was actually when I started trying to learn how to play by ear. Because she hadn't, you just didn't do it in those days. You didn't teach somebody to do that. And so anyway, I worked on that. Then I got a guitar and tried to learn guitar just on my own. And what was after that? I don't know. I guess I tried to learn harmonica, but I was just playing. I didn't even know about cross harp in those days, and so I was playing straight harp. Kind of got into Bob Dylan and marched through all of the albums and. Tried to play every song and all that kind of thing, and learned about him, and and then got in to oldies and from the 50s, and went back into that stuff, and just I really studied it, and I was going to school during all this time, and but then after I met Sparky and I found out about Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, and that's when I started.
Teach you how to play slide.
Yeah, I was trying to learn how to play. That's why. Yeah, I was trying to learn how to play slide guitar or bottleneck blues style, but that didn't happen, did it? Because there's already a guitar player in the family.
I figured if I taught her how to play, she wouldn't have any reason to hang around with me. I kept coming up with excuses. Well, I got this arthritis.
But that's when I really got serious about, and learned about blues harp and started doing that, and that was fun.
She
and
learned to play harmonica in the car, though. That was.
Yeah, I took all 12 keys in the car and threw that and some Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee tapes. It was cassette tapes in those days, and it was a 750-mile ride to Kansas City. And I was playing the whole way. And when we were staying with some really good friends in Kansas City, and the guy he's a good guitar picker, and he plays, Bob Sukio plays some blues harmonica as well. And Sparky walked in the door. He didn't say anything to me the whole time in the car, but he walked in the door and he put his hands on Bob's shoulders and he said, "Bob, please teach this woman how to play harmonica." But it was actually on that tour that I played the first time on stage. Yeah, and then a couple years later, I took blues piano at a music camp at Augusta, and Ann Rabson and Maureen Del Grosso co-taught, and which was perfect because Maureen taught, like, she could transcribe and do everything, so you went home with arrangements and stuff. Ann didn't know what the hell she was doing. I mean, she just played, and so she was just completely intuitive. And so having the two of them teach together was really a gift. And I am forever indebted to those two women. I mean, just, because I love the playing of both of them. And they were great people too, both of them. I miss them very much. But anyway, and Maureen was the one that said, "Why don't you work up something and play it on stage?" Because I was already playing, harmonica, and I can't remember what else, but in those days. So that's how I got started. Just one song at a time, playing blues style piano on stage and other types of things, because by then we were doing Civil War music too. Yeah.
Well, Sparky, how long had you been a storyteller before you realized you were a storyteller?
That's an interesting question.
Have to ask your mama that.
Well, you know the thing about it, I'm one of these kind of people, if I know it, I want you to know it. It's that teacher instinct. I mean, and I used to be a rock and roll performer. I mean, I could mash potato with the best of them. Now I'm lucky to be able to eat mashed potatoes. Time marches on, of course. But when I was influenced by Guy Carrawat and Bernice Regan, you know, to do more folky stuff during the movement. What was your question?
When did you realize you were a storyteller?
The thing is, because I had played rock and roll, we would just play song after song after song after song. And when I became a solo performer, that'll wear you out, you know? I mean, my God. And so I started telling people about the song or who I learned it from. I thought I was a really good storyteller until I heard some tapes of those. And so I would play a song and I'd run, mumble, mumble, mumble. But growing up in the Church of God, comma, sanctified church, which by its very name implies all other churches are not sanctified. Those folks were good storytellers, those preachers. I mean, because you only got one book that you're telling the story about for the whole time, and I've heard that story before. And so you have to be a good storyteller to be one of them old time preachers. And most of them, they couldn't even read anyway. And I grew up, that's where everybody I knew, uncles and whatnot, they were storytellers. My grandmother's dinner table every Sunday, because that's where we went every Sunday to go over you get my grandmother's beaten biscuits. Them had the little fork holes in the top of them. They'd stay fresh for a week. She'd cook them on Saturday, and then I'd come in the next Sunday, a week from now, walk in and she'd go, "They're there in the kitchen." I'd go in there and lift that linen cloth off. That biscuit tasted just like it came out of the oven. Woo! And it was just that kind of thing. And hearing them sitting around that big old round table, all of them telling the same story, but from a different point of view, which made it a different story. And it just absorbed it. I never knew that I was a storyteller until somebody invited me to Jonesboro. I just thought I was just getting up there talking until I came up with the next song.
Well, I think your mother also had a strong influence on that, because she was a reader and she instilled that love of reading in you. And I think that, reading, is a major thing in storytelling. And gosh, what a woman. I mean, she was just she had such an imagination, and so many of your interests, I think you can trace back to her influence on you. And you learned a lot of history.
Thank you. Through
Yeah. I mean, your love of history, I think, came from your mom.
Yeah.
I really do. Yeah. And that was part of it, I think, when I wasn't there when he first, I did see him in the 70s perform, but we didn't know each other. But he was interested in the stories behind the songs. Where did this song come from? And looked it up and then found out more information, and then got on stage and would tell that in front of the song to introduce the song. And then as you did it over the years, got to be a better storyteller, because he was talking about that mumbling thing. That was amazing, listening to an old tape from like the early 70s, I guess. But you get better. It's one of the good things about a lot of venues, will provide you with a recording of yourself, and it's educational. You say, "Oh, that works. Oh, that doesn't work." That kind of thing.
Take that song off the list.
Yeah.
Well, Deidra, you used the word associated with Olivia Records. How did you become associated with Olivia?
Well, for those of you who don't know who or what Olivia Records was, I'll use the past tense because it's no longer a record company, but it's morphed into another lesbian business entity. Olivia was the first women's record company. It was started by a collective of women in Washington, D.C., inspired by an offhand remark by Chris Williamson, who became their first and largest selling artist, and probably one of the best selling artists in overall of independent music. Chris, in an offhand way, as she was leaving just to get together with them, because they were, as a collective, casting around, trying to find out, what can we do to support women? They just knew they had the energy, but they didn't have an idea. And Chris, on her way out the door, said, y'all should start a record company, and she left. But that remark, they were like, oh, yeah, we could do that. Now, they knew absolutely nothing about the record business, which was probably a good thing, because if they knew what they were getting into, they probably wouldn't have. Meg Christian, who became one of Olivia's largest selling artists, second to Chris in terms of sales numbers probably, was a member of the collective, so, Meg knew how to get gigs. But yeah, this group, I think of about 6 women, decided they were going to start a record company. They did a little bit in DC, and then they realized, record company, oh, we're supposed to be in LA. So they moved to Southern California for a while and finally wound up in the Bay Area, and really did an amazing catalog of music that included Chris, whose sales really floated them for a long time, and Meg really put out also, besides music, Pat Parker and Judy Grahn, an album of poetry, brought in, realizing that they needed to expand and present more than just white artists, and brought in Linda Tillery, a wonderful woman in the Bay Area. And the way I got to them was, at some point, they hooked up with Irene Young, who's a wonderful photographer in both the folk area and in women's music. She's photographed just about everyone and is right now working very hard on 2 books. One, a collection of her photography of women's music artists, and another from the work that she's done in the folk realm for Windham Hill and tons of other folk-oriented artists. Anyway, Irene, they hired Irene to do a number of their album covers and really kind of up their game in that regard. And Irene and I were roommates in New York, and I had been in New York just, because you go to New York and try and find a record deal. I used to do the sound at Folk City on weekends. I was their sound tech. Kind of in with that group of the second folk wave that gave us Lucy Kaplansky and Suzanne Vega, Sean Colvin. So it was that time in the Village. And Irene kept saying to me as I'm casting about, how am I gonna get a record deal? She goes, Deidra, you could do it yourself. A lot of people in this women's music, as it was then known, were fundraising on their own. And it finally dawned on me, well, yeah, I could do it myself. Well, the connection is that Olivia was in town because they were doing a concert, actually 2 concerts. Their 2 artists were Meg Christian and Chris Williamson. They booked Carnegie Hall. It was their 10th anniversary. They booked Carnegie Hall. It sold so quickly, they booked a second show at Carnegie Hall. So they sold out 2 shows at Carnegie Hall. So Judy DeLugas, who was the president of Olivia at the time, hired Irene to shoot the concert at Carnegie Hall. And so I talked to Judy a bit when she was in town about the album, that I was doing this album, and she was kind of ho-ha, and said, okay, well, I'll think about it. Well, another artist on the label was Teresa Trull, and I hired Teresa Trull, fantastic singer, songwriter, musician, and producer. I hired Teresa Trull to produce that album. And then Judy said, okay, well, if it's as good as you and Teresa thinks it's going to be, maybe we'll put it out on Olivia. And, you know, so we'll go with that. But so I did the album, all of the albums that I've done, including the one that I just released last week, were funded by what is now called crowdfunding. I've been doing crowdfunding before there was a word for it. I had about 700 people on my mailing list, and I sent out a letter to my mailing list and I said, I'd like to make an album. Can you help? And people started sending me contributions and donations. I also used my credit card. I also worked out some low interest loans that I was just like rabid about, you know, putting on paper and everything and paying back. So that's how I financed that album. That's how I financed every album that I've done, including the last one. Just happened because I did a GoFundMe, so now it's all online instead of snail mailing letters to people, and raised over $30,000 just in donations on GoFundMe to do it. So I would get the music to master, as it's called, and then what I worked out with Olivia, and I was the first artist to do this, I leased my master to Olivia for a certain number of years, and then after the years was up, we could decide to continue or not continue. So I did all the upfront costs of getting the album done, and then they paid for manufacture and distribution and a teeny tiny bit of promo. But the best thing about having that relationship with them is that at the time they also booked the tours for the artists. So they had a in-house booker named Tam Martin, who knew all of this network that had been built up over the last 10 or 12 years, since 1973, of producers around the country that were bringing in artists into their towns and neighborhoods, because there was such a hunger at that time. What women's music became most, like I said, it was a cultural movement to provide opportunities for women in the industry, but in terms of the music itself, it was primarily lesbian identified music, and it was an incredible opportunity for the community to find each other. And it was a powerful way of women coming together within their towns and seeing each other and being visible. And to me, it's really an example of what you were saying, just how powerful a mover music is. You know, beware the movement that sings, because we found each other and we found community and we found strength and we found identity to then push the needle forward, you know, as a revolution. So hooking up with Olivia was a big step into being more hooked into the wider network. The legitimacy of being with Olivia for producers that didn't know me was a great end. But I also, all I've ever wanted to do was sing and perform. And when I first started with Olivia, my first album, Don't Doubt It, came out in 1985. The producers still didn't know me. I'd been, you know, still touring around the country a little. But my first tour, I started out on Greyhound bus. My friend Lori, 5 o'clock in the morning, dropped me off at the Greyhound bus station in Oakland, and I had my guitar, I had a suitcase that converted into a backpack, and I had a luggage cart with a box of LPs. I was carrying around LPs and cassettes, and I got on the bus and started my first tour. However I needed to get to that town, I was going to be there. I eventually was able to move to driving instead of being on the bus. And I remember having someone take a picture of me in Chicago, because I started this tour in January, and took a picture of me standing at the bus station outside in Chicago with snow piled up on either side of me, and me with my gear. And I sent this picture back to Judy and Olivia, and I said, "Are you sure Joni Mitchell started this way?" But that's how important it was for me to have this life in music, and for the women that brought me in, that remember meeting me at a bus station and putting me up in their homes just so I could do a concert in their town, no matter how large or small. That's how much the community needed each other. That's what we did for each other.